The Clown. I admit it, my sense of humor is a bit weird. It's caused me some trouble over the years. For example, the only time I ever got sent to the principal's office at Delmore Blight Junior High was because I laughed in the wrong place at the wrong time. Miss Bindle's math class. They don't make teachers like Miss Bindle anymore. At least I hope they don't. She was tiny, scrawny, and fierce, with an 80-year-old face and 20-year-old red hair. Her wrinkles were permanently fused into a frown beneath the glowing halo of frizzy hair. Miss Bindle was the Jesse James of sarcasm. She could quick-draw a sarcastic remark and drill you between the eyes with it at 30 paces. She once hit Mort Simmons with a slug of sarcasm that spun him around half out of his desk. Then she walked over and coolly finished him off with 2 shots to the head. Mort recovered, but he was never the same afterward. His was a sad case. Mort had always been dumb. The reason Miss Bindle drilled him was that he'd been sneaking a look at one of my answers during a test. That's how dumb he was. Or so Miss Bindle remarked, catching me with a ricochet from her shot at Mort. She never coddled us dumb kids, as did some of the kinder, more merciful teachers. She made us learn the same stuff as the smart kids. A few teachers took pity on us and let us relax in the cozy vacuum of our dumbness. But Miss Bindle forced us to learn everything the smart kids did, even though it took us 3 times as long. Everybody hated her for it, even the smart kids, who were cheated out of the satisfaction of knowing more than the dumb ones. Anybody could see that wasn't fair. But I started to tell about Mort. He couldn't do arithmetic without counting on his fingers. Miss Bindle said she didn't care what parts of his anatomy he had to count on. He was going to learn just as much math as anybody else. Mort did, too, but it was a terrible strain on him, dumb as he was. When we got to multiplying and dividing fractions, his fingers moved so fast he had to keep a glass of ice water on his desk to cool them off. It was a good thing we didn't do algebra in the 7th grade, because somebody would have had to stand next to Mort with a fire extinguisher. It is my understanding that modern educational theory dismisses the use of fear as a means of inducing learning in adolescence. Educators now take a more civilized approach and try to make learning an enjoyable experience. I agree with that. I know that all my children enjoyed school much more than I did. On the other hand, none of them knows how to multiply and divide fractions. I suppose that's part of the trade-off. Fear was Miss Bindle's one and only motivator. It was as though she had done her teacher training at Marine boot camp. She would stick her face an inch from yours and, snarling and snapping, rearrange the molecules of your brain to suit her fancy. It was clearly evident to the person whose brain molecules were being rearranged that breath mints either hadn't been invented or hadn't come in a flavor pleasing to Miss Bindle. The oral hygiene of an executioner, however, is scarcely a matter of great concern to the potential victim. Miss Bindle preferred psychological violence, whipping your psyche into a pink froth, to physical violence. Physical violence was direct and straightforward, something all of us youngsters thoroughly understood. There was no mystery to it. Given a choice, we would have taken the teacher's physical violence, which consisted of snatching the culprit by the hair and dragging him off to the principal's office. As I say, Miss Bindle was extremely short, only about half the size of some of the larger boys. When Miss Bindle grabbed them by the hair and took off for the office, they had to trail along behind her in a bent-over posture, which didn't do a lot for the macho image of some of the guys, particularly if they were saying, "Ow, ow, ow," as they went out the door. On the other hand, if they had stood erect in order to depart from the room in a dignified fashion, Miss Bindle would have dangled from their hair, her feet swinging a good 6 inches off the floor. It was a no-win situation, and wisdom dictated the less painful of the 2 modes of being escorted to the office. In contrast to Miss Bindle, other teachers merely pointed toward the door and ordered, "Go to the office." This method allowed the typical louts, some of whom were near voting age, to leave the room swaggering and sneering. No lout ever left Miss Bindle's room swaggering and sneering. I was a fairly timid fellow and took great care never to attract the wrath of Miss Bindle. I studied ways to make myself invisible in her class, with such success that a couple of times she marked me absent while I was still there. Pitiful victims were snatched from their desks on all sides of me, but month after month I escaped unsnatched, making myself increasingly invisible until there were only a few weeks left of my 7th grade sentence. I thought I was going to make it safely through to the end of the school year, but I hadn't taken into account my weird sense of humor, or my friend Slick. Clifford Slick was the class clown. Old Slick felt his purpose in life was to make people laugh, and he was pretty good at it. Everybody liked Slick. We would gather around him during lunch hour and watch his routines and laugh ourselves sick. He did a wonderful impression of Miss Bindle snatching a kid by the hair and dragging him off. He did both parts alternately, the kid and Miss Bindle, and it was hilarious. One of the reasons Slick got the routine down so well was that he got snatched about once a week. It was though he had researched the act. He knew every little nuance of a snatching and how to exaggerate it just enough to turn the horror into humor. It was a gift. One day before school, I made the mistake of bragging to Slick that I was going to make it all the way through the year without getting snatched by Miss Bindle. Slick was concentrating on combing his hair into a weird shape. His father had shot a bear, and Slick had come into a quantity of bear grease. He slathered a copious amount of bear grease on his hair and was delighted to see that he could now comb it into any shape he wanted. He combed it flat down against his skull so that it looked as though he were wearing a shiny, tight leather helmet. "How's that look?" he asked me. "Funny?" I grinned. "Yeah, pretty funny, Cliff. I like the one best, though, where you comb it straight out from your forehead. It looks like a duckbill." "Okay, good," he said. "I'll go with that. Should get some laughs. Now, what was that you were saying?" I said, "I've never been snatched by Miss Bindle. I'm going to make it all the way through the year without getting snatched." Slick turned a malevolent smile on me. "No, you ain't. Today, you're going to bust out laughing, right in old Bindle's class." "Not a chance." The mere thought of bursting out laughing in Miss Bindle's class would totally paralyze my entire laughing apparatus. It was like having a fail-safe mechanism. "You'll laugh," Slick said. "I'll make you laugh." I shook my head. "No way." In the whole 100 or so years that Miss Bindle had taught, I was reasonably sure that not so much as a snicker had ever been heard in her class, let alone a laugh. It was absolutely insane for Slick to think that I, a profoundly fearful and insecure person, would achieve fame as the one kid ever to burst out laughing within snatching range of Miss Bindle. As soon as Miss Bindle's back was turned to scratch some fractions on the blackboard, Slick went into his routine. He took a dainty sip from his ink bottle and then made a terrible face. His greasy duckbill hair contributed considerably to the comedy. I felt a laugh coming on, but easily strangled it. Slick looked disappointed. Then he stuck 2 yellow pencils up his nose, his impression of a walrus. I felt a major laugh inflating inside me. Slick next imitated a walrus taking a dainty sip of tea. That almost got me, but the laugh exploded deep in my interior with a muffled Suspicious. Olga Bone Marrow in the next row glared at me. Feeling as though I had suffered major internal injuries, I wiped some tears from my eyes. Slick took this as an encouraging sign and pulled out all the stops. He was doing his duckbill walrus, daintily sipping tea while wiggling its ears when Miss Bindle turned to face the class. "Clifford!" she roared, hurtling down the aisle like a tiny, ancient, red-headed dreadnought. Slick's ears ceased to wiggle. The pencils in his nose quivered. A bit of inky drool dribbled from his gaping mouth. He clenched his eyes in preparation for a major league snatching. Miss Bindle grabbed at his hair and headed off down the aisle, obviously expecting Slick to be firmly in tow. But Slick was still seated at his desk, his eyes clenched, pencils up nose. Miss Bindle rushed back and made another pass at his hair, but again her hand slipped off. She snatched again and again with even less effect. Apparently, it was the first time she had ever encountered bare-greased hair on one of her snatchees. All the while, Slick sat there numbly, the yellow pencils poking out of his nose and a terrible expression on his face. Maybe it was Slick's expression that got to me. Or maybe it was the way the teachers stared down at her greasy palms, her eyes full of rage and disgust and incomprehension. Whatever the trigger, it bypassed the fail-safe mechanism. My wild, booming laugh detonated like a bomb in the frozen silence of the room. I could scarcely believe it was my own laugh. I hoped it might be Mort's. Only he might possibly be stupid enough to laugh in Miss Bindle's math class. But no, the laugh, now diminishing from a roar into a sort of breathless squealing, was none other than my own. I had been betrayed by my own weird sense of humor. By Clifford Slick and his bear grease, and yes, even by Miss Bindle. As I writhed in an agony of mirth, half hilarity and half terror, I could feel Miss Bindle's stiletto eyes piercing my living, for the moment, flesh. My stunned classmates failed to find my laughter infectious. He who laughed in Miss Bindle's class laughed alone. And then it happened. "Clifford! Pat!" snarled Miss Bindle. "Go to the office!" She pointed the way with a finger shiny with bear grease. I left the class erect and dignified. Cliff went out the door sideways, doing his comical little vaudeville dance. It didn't get a laugh. After the principal, Mr. Wiggins, gave us his board lecture on the importance of discipline in a learning environment, he ordered us back to class. As I was passing the entrance of the cloakroom, I heard strange sounds emanating from the far end. A quick glance revealed that it was Miss Bindle. At first I thought she was crying, possibly over the disappointment of failing to snatch Cliff's and my hair. But no, she was laughing. Cackling, actually, quietly and to herself. It struck me that Miss Bindle had a weird sense of humor, too.